Good afternoon and welcome to today's event here at RUSI on Great Power Cyber Competition. I am Pia Husch. I'm a research fellow at RUSI's cyber team, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to this panel discussion. Thank you for joining in person and online. This event forms part of the Cyber Statecraft series. And it is also part of a research project with the same name, Cyber Statecraft, in an age of systemic competition. This research project is generously funded by the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council and DSTL. We're much obliged to say thank you to our funders for funding this interesting research project. This project aims to understand how different sectors of the UK cybersecurity ecosystem approach in activities within the framework of international systemic competition in the cyber domain, and what it means to be a UK power with Cyber Statecraft. The project is being delivered by King's College London, the University of Bath, and RUSI. We launched this project last week, so this only forms the second public event of this project series. So stay tuned for any future events we're doing on Cyber Statecraft. Before we dive into the content of today's session, we're going to address some housekeeping rules. We're joined by an audience online and in the room, and all comments made here today are on the record, including the Q&A session. However, I must caveat, any comments made today will only be part of the individual's opinion, not any institution or employer any of our speakers are affiliated with. If you have any questions, please raise your hand in the room when we get to the Q&A session. For anyone joining us online, please pop your questions into the chat and I can address them throughout the session. In case anyone hears a fire alarm, there are no fire alarm drills today. If you hear one, it is the real deal. Please look for a RUSI staff member who will escort you out. And then, as always, online and in the room, please stay kind to one another. And if you're here in person, please join us for a drinks reception afterwards. Enough of the housekeeping. Thank you very much to our four distinguished speakers who are joining us today. All of the four authors who are joining us today have contributed to this edited volume titled Great Power Cyber Competition, Competing and Winning in the Information Age. If you haven't purchased this book yet, please do. The themes of the book and today's events are the threats, challenges, opportunities, and boundaries of great power cyber competition in the 21st century, a very timely topic, and it's our great pleasure to welcome the four authors to here today. All of the four authors address different areas of great power cyber competition in both their published outputs and the book chapters of this respective book, as well as their daily work. We're joined by Professor David Gio, to my right, a British Academy Global Professor and visiting Professor of Intelligence and International Security in the War Studies Department at King's College. David's chapter, which he was speaking about today, addresses the democratization of intelligence, particularly in the Ukraine context. To my left, we have Maggie Smith, who is a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Maggie's chapter today focuses on ransomware attacks and responses. We're also joined by David Higgins, to my right. David is currently a geopolitical analyst in the strategic communications industry, and from 2017 to 2020, he worked for the UK government across East Africa and Somalia, working with African partner military forces. Based on that work experience, David's chapter takes a closer look at great power cyber competition in Africa, zooming in particularly on Russian and Chinese practices. And finally, but certainly not last, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Rod Thornton to RUSI, who specializes in Russian military studies and who teaches at the Defense Studies Department at King's College and the UK Defense Academy. Rod's chapter looks at cyber operations in the context of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This introduction will have given you a good idea of the themes that we will address today, and I'm excited to get started. But before we look into those specific topics, I think it is time to give the stage to our two editors of the book, Maggie and David, who will address a little bit more about the motivation behind the volume in the first place and how you brought together such a unique group of authors who have contributed to the book.
Thank you. Oops, green means go, right?
I think green means go, yes.
So as Pia mentioned, David and I are the editors of this compilation. And before I begin, though, I have to do a more specific disclaimer because I am an Army officer. And so I am here representing myself, and these opinions are my own. I am not representing the United States government, the Department of Defense, or the United States Army. And with that out of the way, so back in 2020, I started teaching up at West Point, the United States Military Academy. And one of their publications that they have that pushes out regular articles that focus on different aspects of defense is the Modern War Institute. And it's a place where military officers, but also those that are interested in defense studies, as well as, geopolitical conflict, they see it as a resource for bright ideas, but also kind of quick once-overs of specific problem sets. It's not a deep, you don't get the 6,000 word articles, you get kind of the shorter ones. And so the Modern War Institute agreed with one of my dissertation committee members, actually, Barnett Coven, who unfortunately can't be here. But Dr. Coven and I came together and thought about a topic for a series of articles where we would solicit works from authors who are also practitioners, because a lot of in the works in the academic environment fail to get what the ground truth is, especially in military studies, because a lot of military officers, a lot of soldiers, airmen, seamen, Marines aren't going to put pen to paper because their jobs are so demanding and they're not focused on producing output like that. And so we reached across the spectrum to come up with an idea of looking at cyberspace and cyber competition and the intricacies of political competition and geopolitics in cyberspace from across the spectrum of operations to include the information environment. And it was really fun because we got to interact and call upon buddies that are in the field and ask them to put out some work. And we got some really interesting authors. And it was later, a couple of years after that series wrapped up, that David and I started talking about pulling this together into an edited volume. And I'll let David talk more about that process because he was really the champion of it and got it done. His attention to detail is astounding. Right. But from that perspective, what we wanted to do was look at different aspects that often are left out of the military conversation. And then it blossomed into something more, and I'll hand it over to David to talk about that.
Thanks, Maggie. I noticed how you said attention to detail and not deadlines, which is a good thing because I think this book probably started, in the late, George Bush administration, and it's been gestating for a while. So anyway, I'll take the credit and the blame for the deadlines. Anyway, thank you again, and thanks to Pia and the team at RUSI, Louise and Tim and the other Cyber Statecraft folks. What's the book about? I'm going to stick to the script, and I do have to give the same sort of extra disclaimer that Maggie does, except I don't like saying that the opinions are my own, because I feel like the government should share my opinions, and if they don't, that's their problem. But anyway, that's the disclaimer out of the way. The West, we are losing the information competition against authoritarian states, particularly China, and to a lesser extent, particularly Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. We are not winning, and we are not even competing very well, in my view, I think in our view, I think in the chapter author's view. And something has to change. And that's the core thesis that animates our book. So what went wrong? Well, the US and much of NATO, as you well know, spent the last 2+ decades focusing on the so-called global war on terrorism, or the GWAT. And I think we got tactical tunnel vision. And as a result, we got distracted and missed the shift to great power competition. And by the time we realized it, the first time this was actually put into national security strategy was in 2017. I think we were already well behind the power curve. Competing with peer and near peer competitors in the cyber domain is a different kettle of fish than fighting the GWAT. It requires a different toolkit. It requires a different skill set. It requires different actors, and I would argue more actors. This is not something that we can just sort of export to, the special forces community or the intelligence community. This is it's a whole of government effort, as our chapter authors note. And you'd think, hey, look, the U.S. and the West, and by West we mean an ideological grouping of liberal democratic states. We don't physically mean the West, but you think we could walk and chew gum at the same time. But I don't think, sadly, that there's the historical basis to bear that out. And as our chapter authors explain, I think we, the West, we place too much faith in technological offsets, right? We've been doing this over and over again. Well, our tech is really great. Just wait till you see it. And secondly, I think we're enamored with older strategic thinking about conventional force-on-force engagements. And so the cyber domain has become the supporting role. Whereas, at least in my view, it's the main event, unless admittedly you are Ukraine or perhaps you are Taiwan. The problem is that Russia and China don't see things the same way. While the West likes to see the sort of at war or at peace duality, Moscow and Beijing operate on a flexible and on a dynamic continuum of competition that seems to befuddle the West. They understand that the best way to compete with us, the West, is through non-kinetic and asymmetric means, classic, indirect, or sub rosa approaches. And this book aims to get us back on track by suggesting a variety of ways to first understand what's going on. If you're a John Boyd Air Force person, perhaps you like the OODA loop. First, we need to observe and orient to figure out where we are. And then the rest of the chapters help us to decide how to decide and act. Well, how do we do this? Through policy and academic coordination, which Maggie's chapter talks about, inside and outside of government, as our friends from the Global Engagement Center have written about, from looking to parallels with other domains, by taking the global perspective, which Dave will talk about in a moment, and by taking history's long view, by understanding the threats and the opportunities that confront us. There are a few differences between this book and the standard academic press book. Price is not one of them, I'm sorry to tell you. And I think it's worth pointing those out because Maggie and I lean into them. And I'll hit the first one and Maggie will hit two more. The first one is that this is an explicitly normative book. We take sides. We make normative calls about good and bad, right and wrong. Academics often simply want to just sort of say, well, look, I'm just an academic and I want to study or explain a phenomenon. Although the cynic in me does note that most books have implicit value judgments that are never really addressed head on, but we'll leave that aside. For us, we wanted to create an academically rigorous roadmap or a toolkit explicitly for use by Western powers to push back against authoritarian aggression in the cyber domain and the information environment. And I'll turn it over to Maggie for the other bits.
Yeah, the second piece of the book is something that I already mentioned, but is really the focus on practitioners. So getting persons that are deeply thinking about these topics, about the normative concerns that David mentioned, but also the state activity and nation state on nation state, but also in the non-state actor realm as well, and how soft power is really playing out in and through cyberspace. But the practitioners are the ones that we really drew from. And in large part, that informs from a different angle from people that are experiencing, having to make those decisions, having to implement the policy on the ground, and are oftentimes the ones that are not heard from in academia. And then I'm going to hand it back over to you.
So, well, I think that captures the book, and I'm grateful to Maggie. As she said, there's a lineage here. There's a prehistory. And Maggie let me jump on the train after it had left the station. So very grateful to you for that. But we wanted to talk more about the book and beyond the book, the topics at hand. We also just wanted to spell out who is behind our book. And I hope several are online. As it happens, we only have 2 UK-based contributors who are kind enough to be here tonight. So just some quick recognition is in order. First, thank you so much to our chapter authors. We had 14 chapters and a whopping 25 authors covering a broad waterfront of the cyber and information warfare spectrum. We don't have time to read their bios at the moment, It's in the front matter of the book, but please be sitting when you do because you will be impressed. So an important safety note there. That's the wrong page. All right, final page. I wanted to also thank Tim Clack and Ollie Lewis, who are the series editors for the Routledge Advances in Defense Studies series. I broached the topic with Tim, basically pointing out, the work that Maggie had already done and saying, hey, can we take this to the next level and really flesh out these ideas in an academic way? And he was super receptive and has been full of good humor and support since we first spoke. So very grateful. I also have to thank my postdoc at KCL, Marina Marone, who's also Rod's chapter co-author, for her patience with indexing, formatting, artwork permissions, diagram reproductions, and just a keen eye throughout the production stages. Marina, I know you're listening. Thank you very much.
I should probably caveat and say that it's Marina's attention to detail, not yours.
That is correct.
Right?
That is correct. So I have no deadlines and no detail. Okay, so that's where Dave is. Finally, some organizational thank yous. First, to the British Academy's Global Professorship Program, of which this is a centerpiece in terms of research outputs. And thanks also to King's College London Department of War Studies for being my host. Also thanks, as Maggie said, to the Army Cyber Institute at West Point for underwriting research on information advantage. And then thank you to Pia again for moderating, for Jamie McCall and the team here. We appreciate you all as well online and here in person. Thanks for giving your time on a rainy March day to come talk about these themes with us, and happy to turn the conversation over to the next event.
Well, thank you very much. I think good to know more about where the idea of the book came from and the process. Having introduced Rod as the last speaker, I think it only feels right to turn to your chapter first. In your chapter, you discuss Russia's cyber operations in the context of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In that context, there's been a lot of hype around Russia's cyber capabilities, followed by perhaps a bit of a realization that many expectations about Russia's capabilities were actually not met. While there are, of course, ongoing, persistent offensive cyber operations against Ukraine still going on now, have we overestimated what Russia can do in cyberspace? And if yes, why?
Have we overestimated? Okay, just as a bit of a background, my chapter is written with Dr. Myron as well, Marina, who's not here today. So just again to add that. What Marina and I wanted to do was to look at, we knew about the background of Russian military cyber capabilities or cyberspace operations. And we wanted to look at, okay, they said they'd do this, and come the Ukraine war, they did this, okay? So that was our basic premise. Now, going back to what David said, we have to understand that the Russian military, for many years, has looked at NATO and said, we can't beat NATO in a kinetic conflict. We need to find other asymmetric ways to, in essence, take on NATO if NATO attacks us. And they do believe, the Russian military does believe they'll be attacked by NATO in the next few years, but let's park that. So thinking along asymmetric lines, information warfare is a big thing to the Russian military. It's far bigger to them than it is to, say, NATO militaries, who focus on kinetic stuff. And to a large degree, the Russian military looks to non-kinetic activity to win its wars for it. Not on battlefields, but within states, within adversary states. So states kind of collapse or melt down from within under the barrage of information warfare that the Russians bring to bear, theoretically. And a lot of theoretical writings in the Russian military literature about how to do this, theoretically. Okay, so with this emphasis on information warfare as a war-winning tool, we can see their emphasis, the Russian military's emphasis on cyber warfare. And they have two forms of cyber warfare. They call them the cyber technical, the kind of cyber attacks, the Nautomons that we can understand as a cyber attack, but also this, what they call the cyber psychological, i.e. influence operations and manipulation operations. And they try and tie these two together. So they work in coordination. So the cyber technical attacks on the Nautomons is going on at the same time as the cyber psychological attacks, the manipulation stuff. And was this applied in Ukraine, and how was it applied? Okay, so let's have that background. We know that Ukraine was attacked after cyber attack by the Russians after 2014 and the initial invasion that happened then. And from 2014 to 2022, Ukraine did come under fairly severe cyber attacks by Russia. NotPetya, we'll remember, but also other attacks on especially on critical national infrastructure. You put out the lights, you turn off the heat in a country in winter like Ukraine, you can have a major effect. And the people under such a cyber attack in their blackened, darkened houses then get cyber psychological attacks saying your leaders are rubbish, your leaders are this, that, and the other. And there's a natural propensity, says the Russian military, that the people will rebel. And there's a phrase in Russian military doctrine called using the protest potential of the population. And that's written in Russian military doctrine. And how you get that protest potential? Information warfare, cyber warfare. So coming on to the actual attack itself on Ukraine, we see what the Russian military is trying to do, especially in the first few days of the invasion, is to create disruption, dislocation, destruction that causes the authorities in Ukraine to slow down their reaction to the actual kinetic invasion. So you're attacking with your cyber attacks, you're attacking the ability of the Ukrainian state to react, to undermine its command and control capabilities at the political level, but also at the military level as well. So you're slowing down the reaction to the forces that are invading your country. And that's kind of really what the Russians try to do. So we see things like the Viasat attack on on the satellite system, which the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian forces were using. So you take down the satellite system, communication systems, everything slows down. So the reaction is being slowed down as the Russian forces move in on the ground. So these kind of things were happening. We also have the deep fake of Zelensky now a deep fake is a mixture of a cyber psychological and a cyber technical. You're creating a deep fake. It was a very clumsy deep fake of Zelensky telling Ukrainian forces to surrender. Nobody believed it because it looked so bad. But these kind of things like deepfakes, as deepfakes get better and better and better, especially with the implementation of AI, then what can we believe in the future when we see our politicians, our leaders on television or whatever? So these kind of things were happening. The Russians, in essence, largely got it wrong because they didn't coordinate too well the various forms of cyber attack. It was all a bit clumsy, all a bit maladroit. But if they had got it right, it could have had a major effect. Because if you remember what the Russian military tried to do in the first couple of days of the invasion was to get into the center of Kiev and take over the government authorities there. The fact that the operation was held up by the Ukrainian forces is in large part because the cyber attacks launched did not have the effect that they were supposed to have.
Would you conclude that Russia does not have the cyber power that we thought it does?
Okay, now we need to be careful here about the Russian cyber power. Yes, it wasn't as good as predicted. We have to look at Ukrainian defenses, cyber defenses, being better than people imagine because the Ukrainians are very clever at IT cyber stuff. We also have to understand that NATO had been giving the Ukrainians a lot of help, a lot of cyber defense help in the run-up to the invasion. So Ukrainian defenses were really, cyber defenses were really quite kind of proficient, shall we say. We also have to understand that the Russians did not develop their capabilities in the cyber field as might have been expected after things like NotPetya, which is very sophisticated. But there wasn't that kind of investment in innovative cyber capabilities after, say, 2017. So it wasn't as good as expected then. We also have to understand, and it is a big issue, that do the Russians want to show their true cyber hand in what many Russian military generals regard as a sideshow in Ukraine? It's not the real war. The real war will come against NATO. That's where we need our proper cyber capabilities. So there's an element of, are the Russians husbanding, keeping their powder dry in terms of their cyber capabilities for the big war, when they can have the massive shock the Russian military doctrine kind of looks to gain in the first few days of a war, what they call an udar, a blow. You can't get the blow if you've shown your cyber hand in Ukraine and NATO cyber specialists say, this is what the Russians are doing. We need to develop these kind of defenses. If you don't show what you're capable of doing, then how can NATO react when the balloon goes up in the Russian minds? So,
Thank you very much. Staying on the topic of Ukraine, I'm going to now turn to David. In your chapter, you talk about the democratization of intelligence gathering in Ukraine. Can you expand a little bit what you mean by that, and can you give us some examples, please?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. So, we, I think, have had an up close and personal view of the war in Ukraine that's been more vivid than any other war in human history. Why is that? It's thanks to this, right? People on the ground with their phones, documenting things, pictures, right? Your camera's always in your pocket. Your geolocation, right, is always in your pocket when your phone is on. And militaries and outside observers have harnessed this differently. My favorite example of the sort of the democratization of information, intelligence, there's a whole debate about that we probably best avoided in the interest of time. But there was a Russian guy, and he was walking, the story, he was walking his dog at 05:30 outside. He lives just a little bit north of the border with Ukraine. And this is in early February 2022. And all of a sudden he sees these missiles just heading south down through his town on these big trucks. And he's like, that's weird. I don't know what that is, right? I'm just a random Russian dude, but I'm going to pick up my phone and I'm going to make a TikTok video of this, been in the news recently. I'm going to make a TikTok video of this, and I'm going to upload it to the internet. And so, does he know what he's looking at? No, he's the first idea, right? He uploads it, and there's a guy, there's a RAND researcher named Scott Boston, and he happens to be an expert in Russian weapons. And he sees this TikTok video, and he's like, oh boy, that's an Iskander missile, and it's headed that way. And there's a bunch of them. And so people don't know exactly what they're seeing, but the internet does. And this is enabling outside observers, right? Oryx, other, the Bellingcat, sort of maybe one of the classic examples, but it's showing us that because there's so much information running around the battlefield, that we now have a sort of, we have more information about what's going on. And this has also gone haywire. Some of my favorite examples are when there's a Russian tourist in Crimea, and he posted some vacation pictures. And one of them happened to be in front of an S-400 battery in Crimea. There's another one where the Ukrainians capitalized on very quickly, where there was in Popasna, there was a Russian journalist, right, a war propagandist, and he was following the Wagner people around, and they were under netting to defeat overhead surveillance. But at the street level, when he's taking a picture, right, of these, Wagner heroes in action, what he put on the internet was street signs. And the Ukrainians were like, great, thank you very much, missile inbound. And those guys were not able to terrorize the Ukrainians anymore. And so it has real world consequences. Right? We don't know, for instance, I think the lawyers have yet to figure out, does that make you a participant? Are you a combatant? Right? Surely if you text something to Ukrainian military intelligence, here they are, right? Okay, you're a combatant. But what if you're just a TikToker, whatever the person, is who uses TikTok, right? You're just the user, and you just throw that up on the internet, and the Ukrainians happen to see it and capitalize it. Are you then culpable? Are you involved? Do you forfeit any Geneva Convention rights as a civilian? So there's a lot of questions that I think are yet as unanswered. But let me stop there and move on.
The legal implications aside for a second, which pains me to say as a lawyer, what are the implications from that involvement of civilians, NGOs? You mentioned some companies as well, and the private sector certainly plays a big role in this. But what do you think are the implications of this for what we say, what in the book you call great power cyber competition?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the Rod distinction, because I really want to focus on the psychological bit, or the human bit. And I think one of the big things is not only is intelligence democratized to people, it's democratized to smaller states. It used to be that you had to have, you know, a U-2 spy plane, or you had to have a satellite, right? You had to have high-end stuff to understand the world around you, right? To see over the wall into the Soviet Union, you know, to give one sort of Cold War example. Nowadays, right, there's Maxar and there's Google Earth, right? And there's a bazillion companies that are providing this. So it's not just the democratization to the user. Smaller states now have these outstanding collection platforms, right? They're commercially available. You know, NSA can, of course, you know, have a big cyber haul, but you can buy commercially available data, right? Just as a for instance. So there's all these new players in there, and so small states, I think, can really have an advantage because once the democratization of high-end collection comes down, then it's about the power of your analysis, right? And who can understand the issue or the subject better to narrow the cone of uncertainty for policymakers. And all, you know, a lot of that rides through social media, but a lot of it rides through, you know, other pipes as well.
I would argue there's another angle to that as well. When you look at small states, they don't have the rigid intelligence organizations and institutions that have an institutionalized way of collecting and actioning intelligence. And so some of the more creative democratization tactics that are being used in what we see in Ukraine can be leveraged, like the Ukraine IT army, and having an impact within Russian borders in cyberspace is a pretty unique example that we've seen, that the Red Cross is all over for the enemy combatant part of it, and trying to figure out what it means for civilians, not necessarily located in Ukraine, to be having an impact on a nation state based on one state's policies or activities and requests for action.
I think that's a very interesting point, especially when you talk about smaller states and perhaps those states that are not the usual suspects in some of these cyber statecraft and cyber power conversations. One thing that your book does very well is zoom in on different regions. And I think perhaps we can now turn to Dave and talk a little bit about your chapter that focuses on Africa and how China and Russia make efforts for influence seeking on the African continent, but they do so in different ways. I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit on their tactics and methods and how they seek influence in Africa, and perhaps also whether they compete with one another.
Sure. Thanks very much, Pia. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, I'd like to mirror the same disclaimers that Maggie and Dave have mentioned, but delete US, add UK as a reservist officer. And secondly, just like to say thanks to my co-author, Tara Hydra, as well. Essentially, I'll give you an overview of the chapter. And China and Russia tend to be regarded together in Africa as a monolithic threat against Western influence on the continent. And each of them actively seeks a multipolar system in which they're the key powers, holding both power and influence. They offer help free from judgment and the evaluation criteria that are required for Western engagement. And they use their influence on the UN Security Council to support their allies. However, as Pia mentioned, and we wrote in the chapter, they differ in both their approaches as well as the sectors they target. And critically, in the past few years, the competition for influence has evolved away from simple economic and military prowess. So what was once an economic and military competition between states is now also one between authoritarian systems on the one hand, and the democratic and economic prosperity of the West on the other, with African partnerships being a stage upon which this is playing out. So firstly, China. So China's embarked on a strategic mission to fortify its global standing and reshape narratives within Africa through a blend of information activities, economic investment, political engagement, and military expansions, most prominently showcased by the Belt and Road Initiative. So this $1 trillion infrastructure project, coupled with China's leading role in financing the digital Silk Road, digital communications infrastructure across the continent, underscores what essentially is a holistic approach to broadening influence, using a mix of hard and soft power tactics. Its efforts to wield soft power, such as cultural diplomacy, so Confucius Institutes, which you may have heard of, and the activities orchestrated by organizations such as the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party, alongside the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is a summit between policymakers, aimed to enhance China's image and solidify interpersonal ties with African leadership. However, despite these initiatives to portray China as a beneficent ally, skepticism regarding authoritarian governance, military ambitions, and the implications these have for national sovereignty and democratic ideals persist. And from a communications perspective, this skepticism is mirrored in public opinion, so both within Africa and globally. And so what we see is that concerns over human rights abuses, financial indebtedness, debt traps, highlight the constraints on China's soft power efforts. So secondly, Russia. So on the other hand, Russia envisions a shift towards a multipolar global order where it stands as an equal power, as China seeks, but seeks to expand its influence in Africa despite financial limitations that curtail its reach relative to nearer regions such as Ukraine. So essentially, Russia is trying to achieve its aims on the cheap. And this is because it's operating from a position of weakness, not of strength. This significant disparity between Russia's declared ambitions and its actual engagement in Africa is evident, primarily because of these economic constraints and because its strategic priorities lie elsewhere, closer to home. And so to bridge this gap, Russia leans on information activities, information confrontation, and uses state-owned media and partnerships to spread its narratives and viewpoints, to bolster its global image and to elicit support from African elites. And so the ways in which we see this happening, it buys up media outlets, local media outlets, so it can channel its narratives through local media channels. And also it has global state-owned channels such as RT and Sputnik, as well, of course, as proxy activities with entities such as private military companies. And Russia uses these to promote its non-colonial history with Africa and its contributions. But importantly, these contributions are minimal. It's just very good at telling a story. So both approaches share the goal of undermining Western influence and promoting alternative models of governance. Both approaches exploit perceived or real withdrawal of Western engagement from Africa and seek to fill the void with their respective economic, military, and informational strategies. So there's 3 points that I really want to bring out from the chapter. It's firstly that Russia and China are not yet competitors with each other, great power competitors. They thrive in different environments and therefore often target different states because they're trying to do different things but on the same continent. Or they compete or they're targeting different sectors within the same states for influence. And so I really question now whether the binary adversarial nature of great power competition is the best way to look at these problems of cyber and information warfare governance. Secondly, I think the West, so far as we can call it that, does have an objectively better and stronger story to tell. And this is, so chimes with what David's saying about this, this competition between the Western ideological bloc and state competitors. We do have a better and stronger story to tell than Russia or China, but we need the will and the confidence to back this story up with resources and to get out and tell this story well. And then thirdly, I think I question the extent to which audiences, so people, have agency in autocratic or otherwise poorly functioning states. Popular sentiment, that's as a working in the stratcoms industry, that's primarily what I deal with now. But popular sentiment on its own is not enough without a functioning civil society and institutions to translate that sentiment into action. I think that really is what the West can offer to Africa.
Thank you so much, David. I feel no RUSI cyber event would be complete and no recent book on anything cyber without mentioning ransomware. So I'm going to turn to Maggie for the ransomware obligatory question.
Sure.
You mentioned ransomware, and you talk a lot about ransomware incidents, both in the US, but then also in other countries. And while, yes, everyone in the room knows how central ransomware is to any ongoing cyber debates, what do you think is the connection between ransomware as a cyber crime and then, on the other hand, great power cyber competition? I think that link might not be that obvious to everyone in the room. Could you please explain?
Yes. Thank you. Great question. So I think there's a recent book came out by Richard Harknett, and there's Michael Fisher-Keller and
Emily Goldman.
yes, Emily Goldman. But it's about it has a theory of persistent engagement. And one of the tenets of persistent engagement where it's continuous action in cyberspace. So in the military, we really like to think about things discretely. So if I take this action, this is going to happen. If I do X, we're going to see Y, or I can influence X by doing Y. And in cyberspace, you don't really have the same dynamic. And so what's I find fascinating about the ransomware aspect of it is that you have different motivations of actors in cyberspace. So malicious cyber actors can run the gamut of petty crimes that are, low-level ransomware hacks or simple DDoS attacks, and it can go all the way up to nation-state hackers in cyberspace. And ransomware can be any of those actors, but the motivation is generally for profit. And so that makes it very complicated for states and their cyber forces, however they categorize them or organize around having an impact in cyberspace or defending in cyberspace or going offensive in cyberspace. It complicates things because you don't just have the traditional nation state on nation state activities. You don't just have the traditional espionage activities. You can have espionage activities that look very much similar and very much the same as operational preparation of the environment or OPE. And then it just muddies the waters a lot because you have this motivation for profit, which you don't see in traditional force on force conflict. Take defense contractors out of the way and the defense industrial base out of that equation, obviously. But when we're talking about motivations, if I'm looking at a nation state, usually the leader has a reason for getting into conflict, right? And then there's a reason to defend your country. And then throw on top of that criminal activity and kind of gang activity, which is where ransomware kind of lies. That's a whole different motivation that states now have to consider when they're thinking about defending their critical resources and their assets. And so I think that's where the real connection is that all states now have to consider a wide variety of motivations when they're looking at defending that infrastructure.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the speakers for introducing their themes. I think we've touched upon some really interesting topics, but we haven't quite had the chance to dive into any of them in greater depth. If there are any questions in the room that you would like to pose to our 4 speakers today, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll turn to the audience online. And if I could ask anyone who has a question to make the question as short and brief as possible, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, Jamie McCall from RUSI. I wanted to ask David Geo a question. So you're obviously quite strident in your view that the West is losing the information war, but the kind of the subject you spoke about in terms of the democratization of intelligence and sort of strategic declassification, that seems to be something where liberal democracies are actually better placed to take advantage of that than authoritarian countries. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about strategic declassification and sort of that in the context of the information environment. I'm interested. So yeah, I mean, I think like Dave, we have a better intelligence story to tell because it means something entirely different. Intelligence means something in the West. When I tell my students, at King's, when they say the word intelligence, say, what do you mean? Put something in front of it. Do you mean American, British, Five Eyes, democratic with oversight? Or do you mean intelligence as in authoritarian, Russian, Chinese, repressive, regime security, whatever the thing is? And so when we look at, strategic declassification, I think that we have a better story to tell, frankly, because we have better intelligence, if I'm honest. And the question is, how do you use it? And how do you use it in a way that you're not going to jeopardize things and lose it in the future? One of the things that, I don't mean to answer your question with a question, but one of the things that I've been looking at, just over the past couple of days, right? So the US clearly had a duty to warn the Russians about, the ISK attack that was sort of bubbling up. And, the Russians, I think, mistakenly put out, just sort of totally poo-pooed it very publicly. Instead of saying something smarter, like, we are omnipotent, we have this in hand or whatever, they just called it a provocation and moved on. The question now is, obviously a terrible tragedy has happened. I'm not saying it could have been prevented, but maybe some other things could have unfolded. The question now, what I'm looking from the US perspective, is how much, if any, are they going to rub the Russians' face in this? Are they going to say, look, we told you a million times over again, or are they just going to kind of be classy and let it lie? Because obviously there's a terrible tragedy. You could exploit this if you wanted to, and really get in there with a narrative, to the Russian people directly, using, some of the strategic communications things, and say, hey, look, you guys were wrong about Ukraine. You were wrong now. Take a good hard look. I don't know if they're going to do that. I do have concerns, I have to say, about strategic declassification, only in as much as, intelligence is ultimately an estimative game, right? And the first time you're wrong, I was in CIA, for the Iraq WMD thing. I was working in the counterterror center at the time. And once you're wrong, right, that's it, game over. And so the credibility that, the US and the UK have built up recently, particularly looking at the warnings, the warnings of Russia planning to invade Ukraine, that was very public. They built up a lot of credibility, I think, at least in the West, in the UK and the US in particular. But that can be gone in an instant, if there's politicization or something else happens. So, the strategic declassification story is a good news story for now, but the downsides are pretty epic. And so I'm one to just throw a little bit of cold water on it moving forward. But in about 2 weeks, I think you'll see another article from me on that. So stay tuned.
Great, we're continuing the promotion of David's work.
Yes, you're welcome. Also co-authored with Maggie.
Excellent. Are there any further questions in the room? Can we have a microphone, please? I can turn to one online first, and then if I ask anyone asking questions to keep it short, can I do the same for the speakers, please? Dave, this is one for you, and it asks about how much of Russia's and Wagner's effort is put into Africa, and perhaps you could expand a little bit on the relationship between what is Russia and what is the Wagner's group's effort in Africa.
Sure. Well, I think personally it's important to note that what we refer to as Wagner Group, as an unincorporated network of companies, it's bifurcated. So we see the Wagner Group efforts in Ukraine, recruiting, mobilizing conflicts. We see a separate but connected effort in Africa. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I think what we've seen certainly over the past year since the death of Prigozhin is that we've seen the Russian state taking control of previous private military company efforts. The Russian state's activity in Africa was predominantly delivered by Wagner Group, but I think it's important to remember that Wagner was never wholly independent from the Russian state. It was financed, it relied on contracts. Prigozhin offered personal loyalty to Putin. So it was never really acting independently, even though it was a proxy for delivering Russian foreign policy. Since Prigozhin's death, we've seen the creation of what was firstly called the Africa Corps, now is called the Expeditionary Corps. And what we see here is a further nationalization of private military company activity. And I think what we see now is for Russian-backed African autocrats, I think it remains to be seen whether the Russian military, which is embroiled in Ukraine, has either the manpower, the resources, the expertise, or indeed the relationships to recreate what Prigozhin was able to offer previously. And what was it that he offered? Well, first, firstly, the most visible aspect of Wagner Group was mercenaries, but mercenaries were only part of the offer of regime support. And arguably more important was his strategic communications effort and political consultancy that could draw on his wider media empire and could support isolated African autocrats in maintaining power. I think since this nationalization, we've seen a loss of plausible deniability on the part of the Russian state that Wagner Group offered, and which allowed Russian-backed subversion to confuse Western responses by not fitting into a neat Western state versus non-state taxonomy. And so now we're seeing perhaps a weakening of the PMC offer. This nationalization is not able to offer what Prigozhin was able to deliver. And so we're seeing a move away from working through the expeditionary corps to a greater use of conventional diplomatic and soft power means. So educational outreach, summitry, and diplomacy.
Great, thank you so much. Can we take one or two questions from in the room, and please keep it short. Thank you.
John Wilson, I'm a member of RUSI and other think tanks. I haven't read your book, so I hope my question doesn't sound too naive, but we hear continually in the popular press here of attacks from Russia and China on the Western countries. We don't ever hear anything about our offensive capability. Now, obviously, I hope we have some. Without giving away trade secrets, we're not presumably sitting there as dumb as we're being painted, are we?
Can we take a second quick question in the room? Is there a second one? No, then Maggie, please.
So we, similar to what the Davids have been talking about, we don't do a very good job of telling our story. And part of that is because anything that touches cyberspace operations, especially in particular in the offensive realm, is really classified at the highest levels and doesn't get released publicly. I think it was back in 2017, it could have been 2019, but NPR, National Public Radio in the US, did a story with Dina Temple-Raston, who is a great podcast host, but also a great journalist, did a story on an operation where the US DoD, Department of Defense forces, hacked ISIS. And so you can find that story online. And so that's one to listen to if you want kind of a rah-rah, let's go type story about an offensive engagement in cyberspace. But I think the challenge really is that how do we successfully tell the story without revealing trade secrets? And so some of the senior leaders, both particularly in the United States military, but also in the UK military, have been doing more and more public engagements, in part because they need to recruit additional cyber talent into the armed forces, and it's very hard to do because private sector offers a lot of perks that the military doesn't for highly skilled and technical people. But there's been a couple great interviews with the UK general that's in charge of the cyber forces about their approach to hunt forward operations, which is what the US calls our kind of their defensive operations, but it's where diplomatic support is requested, or cyber support is requested through diplomatic channels by a nation state, and US military, and now the UK does this too, but will send units to go and look at the activity that is going on their networks in their country, seeing it live, what the adversary is doing to help them work through that particular challenge, that particular breach, or that particular hack. And so those stories are starting to become more public and more well-known. And in particular, since the UK has jumped on board with this and your general is talking about it, it's become more of interest and seen as more of a global effort instead of just something the United States has been chirping about for a while. The last point that I'll make is the other part of the intelligence picture for the conflict in Ukraine and for any modern conflict coming down the pipe is going to be the private sector. So Microsoft has been putting out intelligence reports. They've been providing intelligence to Ukraine. They've been working and facilitating information sharing with Ukraine. And several other private sector companies have been doing the same. And in part because they're seeing the same things. It's not like, you know, a Defense Department entity can see a different picture of cyberspace than, say, your Microsoft, who looks at the system and system of systems levels. And so a lot of the good news stories and a lot of what's happening in cyberspace can be learned through looking at those private sector reports. But when it comes to offensive capabilities, we're going to be loath to talk about it. So I do encourage you to look at that NPR piece.
I have
Sure,
one.
go.
Just
I
very-
yield my time.
Very quickly, from the defensive cyber, Western organizations using it, cyber operations, cyber attacks are often, they can't be controlled. NotPetya, the Russians used it against Ukraine, and they had blowback because NotPetya affected Russian companies just as much affected Ukrainian companies and other European companies, like Maersk almost collapsed because of NotPetya. So when we start using it in the big picture realm, offensive cyber, can you control it? Can you be discriminatory? And if you can't be discriminatory in your use of a weapon, then that runs against the Geneva Conventions. So just we'll throw that one in as a kind of caveat.
Rod, can I pose two online questions to you? One is about how likely is it that Russia is keeping its cyber powder dry? And then one asks about what Russian offensive cyber capabilities would look like once the kinetic war against Ukraine has come to an end.
It's very hard to say what Russian capabilities will one day manifest themselves because, like I've said, keeping their powder dry is one thing. We don't really know what their cyber capabilities might be, but we can guess they are not as good as they once were. Back in the day of like the early 1990s, a lot of young Russians went to Silicon Valley in the United States after the end of the Soviet Union, and a whole brain drain of really top class IT specialists left Russia. Now, Russians are really good at mathematics. They're really good at, as Ukrainians are, they're really deep into this kind of IT stuff. It's in their DNA, which isn't in the kind of Western countries to the same degree. So there's really good human capital in Russia to develop really sophisticated cyber technical attacks. As I said, a lot of it left in the 1990s, and within 3 weeks of the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, 100,000 Russian IT specialists left the country. So it had a massive brain drain. Over 10% of the people who were basically doing IT in Russia left the country. And when you get this brain drain, it's bound to make the Russian capabilities in the GRU, Russian intelligence, Russian military, suffer. They're not going to be as good as they were in the past because they've lost all this intellectual capital. So we can expect to be surprised, possibly in the future, by Russian cyber capabilities, but it would only come as part of a major war, a major kinetic operation. They're not going to use it willy-nilly in some sort of cyber attack in peacetime. It's all going to come in wartime, and then we'll see the true. Then I'll come back here and say, right, or not, as the case may be in a major war.
We will make sure to invite you again. Well, we have space and time for one last question. Over there, please.
Thanks. Tom McGuire, Leiden University. I wanted to follow up the question from the gentleman at the front about how we know what we know and why we know more about Russian and Chinese offensive operations and the sensitivities around, obviously, Western. And some of that is to do with the private tech companies you mentioned publishing a lot of data. Some of it, though, is also to do with our governments increasingly leaning in quite heavily into public attribution, as well, and technical advisories, etc. So I just wanted to flip that round in terms of Russian and Chinese interest in prospectively in the future, if not now, in leaning more into public attribution and therefore exposing and naming and shaming more. I mean, do they have the interest to do so? Do they have the capability to do so? And would we learn more through that route?
Yeah, so I think, remember that they're dictatorships, really, and they're trying to control the information that their population has. So if you say, oh, we've been hacked, it was really bad, it was the US, you're exposing weakness and your inability to be as perfect. as, your narrative is. So I think from my perspective, that's part of the reason that we don't see them doing as much public attribution. Yeah, that's where I'd keep it.
I can appreciate that, given that we're at time. I would like to thank our audience at home. I would like to thank our audience joining from work, and I would like to thank our audience in the room for joining us today and for contributing to the discussion with your wonderful questions. There's been many more questions online that I'm afraid we couldn't get to because we only had 1 hour and 4 speakers. But I'd also like to thank our speakers for joining us in person and for sharing their work and their thoughts with us today. And I'd like to thank our funders for making this work and this event possible.